a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. This is where we gather to revel in wrongthink on a daily basis. Happy to welcome my fellow wrongthinker, Eric Peters from epautos.com. Eric, great to have you on the show again.
Oh, great to be here, Brian. Are we going to play our era's version of Where's Waldo?
Yeah, I was just looking at this article on your website, and you make a good point. It's not Waldo who's missing so much, it's Dr. Fauci. Where has this guy been?
Yeah, all of a sudden, he's nowhere to be found. He's not in the news. He's not being quoted. We're not hearing about his guidance. He's simply vanished. Now, I heard Tucker Carlson, or no, it wasn't Tucker Carlson. It was Ron DeSantis say that he's in the witness protection program. I think he was joking, but he might be serious.
Well, it's very. Look, I'm glad to see him off the stage, but at the same time, I'd like to see him sitting in a courtroom, actually, as a defendant. Answering for some of the things he's done.
Sure. Me too. And that's why it's so frustrating that, like a school of fish, when the lead minnow turns a certain way and the whole school follows the lead minnow, all of a sudden, Putin bad, Ukraine good. So as to get everybody's attention off of this horrendous fiasco, and not just the horrendous fiasco, but those who are responsible for it. We didn't need masks. We didn't need ivermectin. We didn't need monoclonal antibodies. All we needed was Putin to solve the pandemic.
Boy, apparently. I know the Babylon Bee actually made some fun of this and said, Putin has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Medicine for stopping the COVID pandemic. But give me your take. I know that you're a person who watches with a critical eye, and you're probably not as prone to propaganda as some might be, but have you ever seen such an onslaught like we have seen since the hostilities began in Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. 2 years ago.
Okay.
It's exactly the same thing, and it's from exactly the same people. The bits and pieces are a little bit different. Last time it was a virus that was going to kill us all. Now it's Putin going to kill us all, and it's coming from the same sources who are whipping up the same hysteria to get everybody whipped up into a frenzy, an insane frenzy. It is as bad as the whole thing with the diapering and the sickness kabuki. I've been following articles all over the world about how, for example, cat shows, they're banning Russian cats. and people are pouring Stolichnaya down the drain. And all these other simple-minded idiocies and performance moralizing, kind of like the whole thing with the diaper wearing. People who put these things on to show how virtuous they were, how much they care. Now everybody cares about Ukraine, and it's so fatuous, despicable, and simple-minded. And I'm not a Putin poodle. I'm not saying that Putin is some kind of moral avatar. I'm saying this is a complex business, and there's good and bad on both sides. And one thing that's particularly bad on our side is that this whole thing is distracting the entire public from holding accountable the people who have been brutalizing this country for the past years in the name of this so-called pandemic.
Amen. No, that is my biggest concern right now. Even more so than gas inching up over $4 a gallon. Even more so than the prospect of. I'm even more concerned about this than I am the prospect of nuclear war, and that is the idea that somehow the people who pushed all of that tyranny on us the last couple of years are somehow going to scurry away while everybody else is distracted and chanting in unison about Putin bad.
Sure, and as far as nuclear war goes, this might be just as bad in terms of its effect. Gas in my area is already over $4. In some parts of the country, it's at $6. And it's not just gas, of course. It affects everything. It affects the cost of food in the stores. And we're going to reach a point of mass impoverishment in this country very soon if something that is not done to rectify the situation. Try to visualize a world in which a gallon of gas costs $7 or $8. Oof. And a pound of ground beef costs $12 or $15. It's not sustainable. It is going to cause people to lose their homes. It's going to crater the housing market. You and I were talking a little bit about that off the air. I live in a fairly rural area, and most people who live here have to drive 60, 70, 80 miles every single day to get to work and back. And are they going to be able to afford to do that when it costs them $100 or more to fill up the gas tank of their car, and it costs them $200 to get a small bag of groceries? Absolutely not. It's a recipe for a kind of financial economic implosion that could be far worse than what this country experienced in the 1930s during the Depression. And it's completely artificial. It's totally contrived. There's absolutely no reason for this other than the CYAing of these political psychopaths who want everybody to stop thinking about what happened to them over the past 2 years.
Well, the good news is our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, has just said, well, if you're concerned about gas prices, go buy an electric car. So there you go.
Yeah,
problem solved.
This is our era's version of, the Marie Antoinette let them eat cake thing.
Right.
Buttigieg gets paid, I don't know how much. He's got to be getting at least $150,000 a year minimum, and that's probably way underestimating it as a cabinet level official in the federal government. So, of course, for him, spending $50,000 to get an electric car, who doesn't do that? He and all of his friends have no problem buying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 vehicles. But they're utterly economically tone deaf, or they're vicious and horrible people. If they don't understand that for average people, they can't afford to spend $50,000, $60,000 on an electric car. They simply can't do it, leaving aside whether electric cars are neat and whether they're clean, and that's a whole separate issue. At the end of the day, they cannot do that. You're talking about doubling, if not tripling, the cost of transportation for the average person, and it's just obscene.
No, that is the one place where I do feel a little pang of concern is when I look at the fuel prices, because I remember, and I'm sure you remember too, back in 2008, 2009, when we were, I guess it was just before Obama was elected, we had gas prices, inching up there, about where they are now. And I remember not only did the price of everything go up, but that's when I saw businesses have to close their doors because they just couldn't be profitable.
Sure, absolutely. We're not getting a raise to make up for the increased cost of things. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite, because in addition to the price of gas going up, the value of our money is going down. We admit to something on the order of 7% inflation over the past 13 months, but shadow stats and some other more reliable metrics and measurers of these things say that it's about 15%, and that makes sense to me if you just go by things like the cost of food in the store. Now, if you go back and look at what things cost, say, a year, 13, 14 months ago versus what they cost now, you can see that the average cost of things is up by about 15%, leaving aside the fact that now we're supposed to spend $4 on a gallon of gas or more.
Amazing. Someone made the observation the other day. I wanted to bounce this off you because I thought Eric would appreciate this of all people. The crisis that we face right now isn't COVID. The crisis is not war in Ukraine. The crisis is a population that is so easily led from crisis to crisis. Give me your thoughts on that.
Without question. Well, without question, that's absolutely true. They sit addled in front of their TVs, and whatever comes out of that boob tube, remember when they used to call it the boob tube?
Oh, yeah.
They accept it. They received wisdom almost as if it were a deity. And I think part of the reason for that is that up until now, there haven't been any direct real-world consequences for a lot of these people. They've been able to exhibit their performance virtue signaling by going along with whatever the narrative is, but the fridge is still full. Their gas tank, they can afford to fill that. They can afford to buy food, and life goes on. So they can preen and posture and feel good about themselves without having to bear the cost. Well, we're about to bear the cost. And by the way, there's something extremely interesting to me about what's going on with regards to Putin bad and Ukraine good, and it is this. Can you imagine what will happen if Putin decides to start selling oil on the world market for approximately what it costs them to get it out of the ground, which is, I understand it, is only about $10 or $15 per barrel. You can imagine that. And only accepts gold or any other medium of exchange except for the U.S. dollar. Imagine what that's going to do to the West.
Oh, yeah. Actually, later in my show, I have an article from Tom Luongo that talks about this very possibility. He's like, people are looking at Putin and saying, oh, look, these terrible weapons he's using in Ukraine. It's like he hasn't used his most terrible weapon. And it's exactly what you're describing, selling oil for gold.
Yep. I have a grudging admiration, or I should say a respect for Putin, who, unlike our leadership, is both a nationalist, I think, and he's interested in the welfare of Russia and the Russian people, and good on him for that. If I were a Russian, I'd be grateful to have a leader like that. And he's also not an imbecile, like the people who rule this country. So, this simple-minded narrative that he's just trying to to stomp through the Ukraine. It's Hitler all over again.
Right.
It's not just stupid, it's dangerously stupid to not try to understand the nuances and what's going on here.
Literally Hitler. Where have we heard that before? Oh, yeah. Starting in about late 2016, it seems like that became the mantra. I guess Putin has now taken the place of Trump, now that Trump is off the stage.
It's one of these hot-button words that the woke left likes to trot out because it does have a lot of power. At least it did initially. It's a little piece with screeching that if you raise your hand and ask an impolitic question about, let's say, quotas, that makes you a racist.
Okay, hold that thought, Eric. We're going to continue our conversation just the other side of these commercial messages. Again, we're talking with Eric Peters from epautos.com. I'll have a link in the show notes. We'll be back right after this.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. We are talking with Eric Peters from ericpetersautos.com. And Eric, I have to credit you. When I heard Buttigieg's comment yesterday about, well, just buy an electric car if you don't like gas prices, I thought, thank goodness I am friends with Eric Peters, who has given me another angle to consider on electric vehicles. And frankly, I don't know. Not only have you shown me some of the downsides of electric vehicles, but I have to wonder what's going to happen to the cost of electricity when suddenly that's in higher demand than gas. I assume that cost will go up correspondingly.
Well, exactly. Supply and demand, right? I mean, this is just fundamental basic economics that people who, used to go to like freshman economics in college had some elemental grasp of. But now, because the general populace has been stupefied by this infantilized point of view of the world, they don't get that. They don't stop and think, well, wait a minute now. If we substantially increase demand for electricity by having the entire vehicle fleet or a large portion of it turned over to electric cars without increasing the generating capacity, the production of electricity, what do you suppose the effect of that might be on the price of the electricity that you use to power up your electric car? It just makes you want to look at them and go, duh, like we used to do in 7th grade. And I know that that's juvenile, but it's sometimes appropriate.
No, and I really appreciated your article on the labor theory of EV value. And I would encourage that my listeners check this out because there's a lot of wishful thinking that goes into, well, electric cars, not only are they going to save the environment, but, they're going to be financially feasible too. You've made the case many times over that without government subsidies, people still, the market itself is not demanding these electric cars.
No.
It's more like we're being shoehorned into an electric car solution.
No, even with all of the subsidies, and this is quite telling, I think, even with all of the subsidies and the favorable treatment that's given to electric cars, the least expensive of them are in the low $30,000 range. Now, to put that into some perspective, you can go out and buy a Toyota Corolla, anything equivalent to that, a Honda Civic, cars like that. You can pick up one of those for about $18,000. Okay, so you're talking about roughly doubling the price of a car for the average person, and that Corolla will go 400 or 500 miles on a tank full of gas, whereas the electric car might go 200, maybe 200 something, possibly, and all of the other things that go along with that. And it's not something that would sell, on the market by itself, except in small numbers, because most people, shockingly, don't want to pay a gigantic sum more for something that doesn't work as well as the less expensive alternative.
Gee, I can't imagine why.
Right. So that's why they have to force this on people. And, what they're doing right now by forcing up the cost of gas and oil is that they hope they can force people into electric cars by making the electric car artificially seem like it is a more economical alternative. The problem is that you're left with no alternative except an extremely expensive vehicle. It's either extremely expensive to fuel if it's not an electric car, or it's extremely expensive to buy if it is an electric car. And then when people start buying the electric cars and the demand for electricity goes up, then it's going to cost that much more to put the electricity into the electric car. So it's a zero-sum game where we lose and the people behind all of this win.
So let's talk for a moment. I want you to strategize with me about high gas prices. Obviously, you know, my days of, I feel like just getting in the car and going for a drive. When gas gets up this high, suddenly that is not so much of an option. What do you recommend for people who are determined to maintain their freedom and their mobility in the face of prohibitively high fuel?
Well, we can't really do a whole lot about the price of gas. The only thing that we can do is figure out ways to reduce what we spend on other things. So to be, as our grandparents were, more frugal and careful about how we spend our money and on what we spend money on, and to make as much use of the things that we have as we possibly can as a way to counterbalance the effect of these high costs that we really can't do that much about. One thing that I'm doing, and I think you're doing as well, and I know we've talked about it, is raising my own food, which reduces the cost of food at the grocery store. And that, in turn, gives me a little bit more money so that I can buy fuel for my vehicles.
Yep, and like you, I'm following your example of we are now getting chickens as part of raising more of our own food. I'm noticing that there are some pretty serious-looking people these days. Picking up, gardening implements, picking up, the things that'll make it easier for them to grow more of their own food. And thankfully, I'm living and you're living in a little more rural area, but I feel for the folks who are trapped, in a more urban setting where that may not be possible.
No, I do too. I feel horrible for them because they're completely enthralled to these forces. They have almost no control over them. The cost of the gas, if they have gas heating in their apartment, condo, or house, the cost of the water, which isn't their own well water that's being pumped by some central authority to their house, and everything else, and simply not having the ability, really, because they don't have, say, enough land to have animals, or they can't because of local regulations. But even so, there are things that you can do. If you really want to get into this and get creative with it, you can grow vegetables inside and on a remarkably small piece of land on the outside. And that's one very effective thing that you can do to claw back some of the control that is being wrested away from you over your life. And, the key thing I think now is just to keep calm, hunker down, and build associations with your friends and your neighbors so that you can ride through this. Because I do think we're going to be in for a rough period of time.
Amen. No, I wholeheartly echo what you're saying. This is the time to know who you can count on. And if you haven't built those relationships or mended those fences, if there's a rift of some kind, this might be a really good time to take care of that before things get desperate. Hopefully that doesn't sound too cryptic or too apocalyptic, but I agree. Well, we've got tough times ahead.
It's tough, but one thing about it that I consider to be salutary, good, and healthy is that reality is asserting itself, and fraudulence and falsity and all of these things that have been corrosively eating away at what we used to consider to be America are coming back. People are beginning to realize that actions have consequences, that ideas matter, and that being of substance or trying to be of substance, be upright and honest in your dealings, and to associate with people who share those values is how you build a society as opposed to tearing one down.
Hear, hear. Eric, we got just a couple of minutes left here. Let's take a brief look at anything automotive that's on your radar screen. I know that you have a great love of things with wheels, both 2- and 4-wheeled variety. Anything fascinating that's come in and out of your driveway here of late?
Well, nothing particularly fascinating. There, on deck, I hope to get within the next 2 months, assuming the nukes don't fly, is the jailbreak version of what will be the very last of the Hellcat Challenger and Chargers. Are you familiar with that?
I can't say that I am.
Well, rather than go gently into that good night, Dodge, bless them, has decided to put one last thumb in the eye before they can no longer legally build vehicles like the V8-powered Charger and Challenger. And so they're coming up with this final big bang in the jailbreak edition of the Hellcat Challenger and Charger Rimride, which will have more than 800 horsepower.
Oh, my word.
From its supercharged Hemi V8, and which will dabble into the 9-second range through the quarter-mile on drag slicks.
Okay, that's pretty impressive. Well, hopefully the V8 will continue to live on. I don't mean to imply we're headed for Mad Max times, but the movie does make me think about what's been happening to all
Yeah,
of our
I look at my Trans Am in the garage, and, that's what it is. It's awesome of V8 Interceptors, except mine happens to be orange, except black.
Tell everybody where to find your website, Eric.
Sure, it's epautos.com. I'm pretty easy to find. You can also just type in my name on pretty much any search engine, I suppose, unless I've been blackballed and censored, and you can find my stuff that way.
Okay, and I know I include the LouRockwell.com website as one of my regular resources for wrong thinkers. Yep. Eric is a very regularly featured writer on that site. Eric, great to catch up with you again. Keep a stiff upper lip, pip and all that.
You bet.
We'll talk again next week.
We'll talk soon. Thanks, Bryan.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. Yeah, it's no secret. We live in a time of extreme misinformation, deception, propaganda. Oh, I could think of a few other words too, but not all of them are fit for polite society. Bottom line is, there is a battle on for your mind, and you get to make the choice. You get to choose. Where does your allegiance go? What do you consider reality? What do you consider the basis upon which you understand the world around you? Well, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I'm definitely here to tell you that you've got to think as clearly and independently as possible. That's what this program is for. Our program is brought to you by great sponsors like HSLAmmo.com, also sewingandquiltingcenter.com, MonticelloCollege.org, LifesavingFood.com, and the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage. Easy for me to say. People who understand that their natural rights limit the power of government over them are the same kind of people who are less likely to simply obey whatever the ruling class is telling them to do. Got a great article here from Alexander Salter on reason, rights, and liberty in the good life. He says, natural rights are the foundation of a just government. Life, liberty, and property are non-negotiable. The pursuit of happiness, meaning a life well lived, not mere satisfaction or pleasure, depends on the government respecting man's rights. Now, just as an aside here, do you realize there's a time where that would have been just common sense? Seriously, the average person would have just, well, of course, yes, this is self-evident. I mean, you'd figure this out just walking down the street. But for some reason, this is not well understood today. And it's probably not well understood because we've lost touch with our roots, especially our philosophical and principled roots. Alexander Salter asks, well, where do these rights come from? The Declaration of Independence asserts that all men are endowed by their Creator with rights. Now, the founders had no problem in believing in a divine sanction for each person's moral entitlements. So to them, respecting natural rights meant honoring God, the source of human dignity. He says we have a duty to protect rights because we have a duty to obey God. However, natural rights are not a specifically religious concept. In fact, he says even those who don't believe in God understand the natural equality of men also proclaimed in the Declaration. Because human persons are moral equals, we must regard our fellows as ends in themselves. He says when we trample on the rights of others, we subordinate them to our own ends, reducing them to mere means. And it's wrong to treat people like tools. A human being is not an instrument to be manipulated by his presumed betters. Alexander Salter says, equal personhood means equal dignity, which establishes rights as a universal principle. Now, he goes on to explain that natural rights deserve protection for reasons other than just duty. Results matter too. And when it comes to results, he says, for example, societies that value life, liberty, and property are wealthier, healthier, and more socially equal than societies that don't. A rights-respecting society is a free society, in which human ingenuity can best solve important social problems. Creativity requires freedom because creativity can't function under coercion. Alexander Salter writes, the greatest institution for harnessing ingenuity is the free market. And he says, once upon a time, all of humanity was wretchedly poor. Now, thanks to the power of markets, we enjoy living standards that would be unimaginable to our ancestors. So, for example, on average, an American earns about $63,000 a year. That's about $170 per day. Now, in comparison, it wasn't that long ago that everyone but aristocrats had to live on less than $2 a day. This enrichment would have been impossible without market-supported innovation, which in turn requires private property and the rule of law. So free markets are the extension into the economic sphere of man's natural rights. Now, if duty is too abstract a concept for you, an 85-fold increase in living standards is a pretty good reason to defend natural rights. Life, liberty, and property deliver the goods, plain and simple. Salter says, protecting rights also helps us become better people. Performing our duty isn't automatic. We have to work for it. And good consequences don't materialize by ourselves. We have to make them happen. He says our ability to build worthy lives for ourselves, our families, and our communities depends on good ethical habits, which help us bear the weight of duty and strive for great achievements. In the Western philosophical tradition, we call these ethical habits virtues, and a virtuous person is someone who has exercised their moral muscles over and over again. You become a good man the same way you become good at free throws. Practice, practice, practice. Alexander Salter says some philosophers who believe statecraft is soulcraft want to use politics to make men good. But the most government can do is make us free, because freedom is a prerequisite for virtue. He says coerced virtue is a contradiction in terms. A soldier who fights only when compelled by an officer isn't courageous. A citizen who only gives to the poor when compelled by a bureaucrat isn't charitable. Natural rights promote virtue by creating the social conditions necessary for people to grow and flourish. Citizens protected against force and fraud are free to work on the most important project of them all, themselves. So, duty, consequences, and virtue point to a common truth, and that is natural rights are woven into the fabric of reality. And Alexander Salter says any political philosophy that denies man's inalienable rights is un-American and inhuman. True justice requires life, liberty, and property. I've had the opportunity to interview Alexander many times in the last few years. And I really like his take. By the way, he and I don't line up on a number of things, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is one of the best explanations I've heard about reasons for rights and how liberty and the good life are inseparably connected to government being limited by our natural rights. But to a lot of people, that's going to sound just like a foreign language. I'll tell you the big takeaway that I take from his article, though, is that the most important project of all is working on ourselves. And in a time where there's so much that is just clearly out of our control, in the sense that you and I cannot look at the geopolitical situation, wave our hand, and affect change. Even if you, let's say, for instance, you suit up and you go to Ukraine to fight or something like that. That's probably not going to change much either. But the one place where we do seem to have a remarkable amount of influence is what do we have to offer society in terms of ourselves? This is what Albert J. Nock referred to as the one improved unit. Do you want to make society a better place? Great. Offer society one improved unit. And that means we start with ourselves. And I don't want to make this sound like, hey, it's a rah, self-improvement. Everybody, buy my course and I'm going to get you on the pathway to success and fame. And nope. It's something much simpler than that. And yet at the same time, it's also harder because it's so simple. If you are actively striving to become the best version of yourself, and only you are the one who gets to make the call of what is that best version. What does it look like? Is it someone who can spout, every bit of the Constitution from memory? I mean, for some people, that might be it. For others, it might be the best version of yourself is a good, honest person who can be counted on to do the right thing for the right reasons at all times and in all circumstances. You find a stranger's wallet laying in the parking lot at the grocery store. You don't pick it up and, liberate any cash from it and then toss it aside thinking, well, sucks to be them. A truly good person does what it takes to reunite that wallet and its contents with its owner. It's not even an afterthought. It's just, nope, this is what a good person does. It's consistency in knowing your principles, knowing who you are and what you stand for, and then living up to it day in and day out. And I know that I'm making that sound like, well, it's just so easy. You just, be a good person and it just takes care of itself. But if you've been around the block once or twice, you understand this takes significant effort. And there will be twists and turns and temptations and tests and traps and trials that will come along and try to distract you or tempt you to take an easier path. I don't know what your personal path to greatness is, but I say this with absolute confidence. I am 100% sure there is personal greatness within you. And in fact, I believe that personal greatness has been placed exactly where you are right now at your stage in life and where you are, geographically by a wise and loving God, because there is something you can do to contribute to the betterment of this world. In fact, it's something only you can do. And if you're serious about doing it, the very first thing you got to do is build your understanding of what are my inalienable rights. What are the principles and the practices of freedom? Know them and live up to them. That's the key.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. I want to give a shout out here to the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage. Heather's NMLS ID is 715386. Patriot Home Mortgage is an equal housing opportunity lender. Why should you talk to the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage? Well, I'll admit, this is a message probably of greatest importance to my listeners located in the great state of Utah. And particularly if you are one of the people who has recently moved to Utah from points unknown. All I know is that there's a steady flow of people from other states to the Intermountain West. And if you're looking for a home, it's a very competitive real estate market. So Heather's the one you want on your side to make things happen when time is of the essence. Now, you can click on the email link that I provide in my sponsor links in my show notes. You can also call 435-703-4522. Count on the experience and the insight of the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage to get you the loan you need quickly and at the best rates possible. By the way, if you're keeping tabs on home prices, you've probably noticed that they are still very much on the rise. And I think this is true in most places in the country. Got a great article here from the Foundation for Economic Education. This was written by Patrick Carroll. Here's the real reason young people can't afford a home. He says the housing crisis is fundamentally a supply and demand problem. Patrick Carroll says, like so many millennials these days, Charles Bryant has been having a rough go of things in recent years. The 39-year-old New York native had a good job as a hotel manager in Delaware, but things changed quickly when the pandemic hit. Bryant recently told Fortune, I was one of those guys that had a 5-year, 10-year plan. I wanted to be at a certain place. Unfortunately, those plans dissolved when he had to take a pay cut and eventually made the hard decision to leave his hotel job. He said the pandemic halted all the positive momentum I had built professionally in the 10 years prior. Now, after searching for new opportunities, Bryant finally found a job as an operations manager for a major retailer, a position that's helped him through these trying times. But while he may have avoided the worst, his life is still far from where he wants it to be. He has $42,000 in student debt and lives with his parents, an arrangement of necessity given the skyrocketing price of homes. In a lot of ways, Bryant's story reflects some growing trends. Many young people have had to change course in recent years. In fact, many are saddled with student debt. Many are living with their parents. Indeed, roughly 58% of 18 to 24-year-olds were living with their parents in 2021, as well as roughly 17% of 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, the reason for the trend is not hard to pin down. A staggering 70% of Americans between the ages of 23 and 40 who want to buy a home say they can't afford to do so. That's according to Peter Rex in a recent Newsweek column. And those who can are doing so at a later age than their parents. In all, only 43% of millennials are currently homeowners. And with house prices up nearly 120% since 1965, adjusting for inflation, that number will likely remain low for quite some time. So, why are housing prices so high? That's a question everyone's asking, but few seem to have a good answer for. Patrick Carroll says some blame greed, but that argument doesn't really hold water. People haven't suddenly become more greedy than they were a few decades ago. Another explanation is that money printing from the Federal Reserve is causing inflation, and that is certainly part of the problem. The Fed's purchases of mortgage-backed securities in particular may be inflating housing prices above what they would be otherwise. But with housing prices ballooning so quickly, inflation doesn't likely account for the lion's share of the price hikes. What does account for it is good old supply and demand. Simply put, the primary reason housing prices are soaring is because supply is being limited while the demand is growing. And with respect to supply, there are basically two ways to expand, up and out. So on the one hand, cities can build taller, higher density residences. On the other hand, they can build on new land at the outskirts of the city. Now the problem is, both of these options are seriously unpopular. With respect to building up, many people are fiercely opposed to high-density developments in their local communities, and as a result, most municipalities have strict zoning laws that prevent or at least limit these kinds of initiatives. Now, if you suggest building out, you quickly encounter the wrath of environmentalists who are on a mission to mitigate urban sprawl, and environmentalists have passed many land use regulations too. So the Greenbelt in Ontario, for instance, is a 2 million acre swath of land surrounding Toronto permanently protected from development because of environmental considerations. Patrick Carroll says red tape is another huge barrier to housing development. Permits, building codes, and all other sorts of regulations make it far more expensive to build new homes than it needs to be. And those expenses make it that much harder to increase the supply of homes on the market. Now, the demand for housing, of course, is largely determined by population. Generally speaking, the more people there are in a country, the more demand there will be for housing. Population changes are in turn determined by two factors: the natural growth rate accounting for births and deaths, and net migration accounting for immigration and emigration. In the U.S., which currently has a population of about 334 million, the natural growth rate and net migration rate are both positive, so they both contribute to the increasing demand for housing. Now, he says historically the U.S. population has grown by about 0.9% per year on average. It's not a particularly high rate, but it's enough to put some constant pressure on the demand side of the equation. In the end, though, it's all about trade-offs. Patrick Carroll says now that we've identified the problems, the solution should be obvious, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not quite how economics works. The point of going through the factors affecting supply and demand wasn't to identify potential solutions, but potential trade-offs. As we've seen, there are many ways that housing prices could be brought down, but if you look closely, every single one of them requires that we sacrifice something. So we could relax zoning restrictions, for instance, but then people would have to sacrifice the character of their neighborhoods. We could stick it to the environmentalists and embrace urban sprawl, but then we would have to sacrifice the environment and the benefits that come with preserving it. We could relax permits and regulations, but we would sacrifice oversight and assurances of safety. And similar trade-offs exist on the demand side. Though few would be in favor of government interference with the natural growth rate, many people are open to changing immigration policy. And it's not hard to figure out that fewer immigrants mean less demand. The trade-off, however, is that you lose the economic and cultural benefits that come with free movement, which can be fairly significant. So, grappling with these trade-offs helps us put the housing price problem into perspective. It's easy to want more affordable housing, but the question is, what are you willing to give up to get it? The character of your community? Environmentalism, oversight, immigration. You have to pick something. If you don't, prices will just keep going up. Now, having said that, he says it's important to note that recognizing these trade-offs is not the same thing as making a moral judgment about these policies. For instance, the fact that lower immigration would lead to lower housing demand doesn't mean that lowering immigration is what we should do. The point is to recognize that there's a tension between all of these things and that something always has to give. Now, there's room to choose what it is that we sacrifice, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. You can't have your cake and eat it too. As Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So having established the inevitable trade-offs that exist in a world of scarcity, the question then becomes, why haven't we figured out a better trade-off yet? Surely the status quo isn't our best option, is it? Well, the answer has to do with the nature of the political system. The first lesson of economics is scarcity, said Thomas Sowell. There's never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. So the fact of the matter is, politicians hate acknowledging trade-offs. As a result, they spend little time considering them. They want to talk about what they'll give people, not what they'll take from them. We will lower the price of housing is a winning platform. We will lower the price of housing by increasing the density of your communities and allowing urban sprawl is more accurate and balanced, which is precisely why it's political suicide. Remember, the first lessons of politics is to ignore the trade-offs. Aldous Huxley reminds us, but facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. And Ayn Rand says you can avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. In other words, trade-offs still exist whether we want to acknowledge them or not. Thus, real solutions, or shall we say improvements, need to begin by acknowledging the trade-offs. The essence of any political position is not only to want what you get, but what you're willing to give up in order to get that. See, that's the true discussion we need to be having if we want to make any progress on this issue. Now, you might choose a different trade-off. You might choose different values like property rights that hopefully play a role in that decision. But Patrick Carroll says the point is that something always has to give. So what's the real reason young people can't afford a home? Well, simply put, it's because most people are not willing to give up any of the values they hold that are restricting supply and increasing demand. And as long as that remains true, he says prices will continue to soar. Very informative article, some great charts and graphs that go along with it. Click on the link I provide in the show notes. You'll find it at thebryanhydeshow.com.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show.